back here.
Part two.
Part two, yeah, after taking a little break. So yeah, last minute ago we were just talking about kind of Chris's call and some of the super cool ways God was working in your heart and through your church and through His Word, and super cool. So if you're starting this new video, I'd really encourage you to go back and watch that from our first one. But now we're kind of into heading onto the mission field. You've got this conviction, this call. You're working with your church, and you mentioned 7 months after this short-term trip, you're on the field in Jamaica. So walk us through it.
So one of the processes leading up to it, and even during the process, God challenged me in some of my personality. And so I think one of the key aspects on that was just kind of even from an understanding of God equipping, but there was, I'll just kind of share. So there was a financial aspect. At that point in my life, again, late 20s, heading into 30, was a manager for a Fortune 50 company, making pretty good money. I'm not going to lie, I made pretty good money for being a single guy, and had put away a lot. And so giving had been one of my spiritual gifts. So loved to be able to bless people in giving. Humility, maybe not so much. So this whole asking part was a struggle, to say the least. So we had kind of come through, again, got back in August, prayer, fasting, supported my church. We're walking through this. We rolled into the fall, had met with the ministry, talked to them. They were very excited because didn't know, but they had somebody who was leaving the field, and they didn't know who was going to replace Scott. And so they were very excited about the potential of me coming down, because when we asked about the time frame, Scott was leaving in April, and I was hoping to be there maybe in March. Wanted to go down with the Hope College team, which went down every year. And so it kind of like, again, not knowing anything about this, I'm like setting timelines and goals, because that was very much my type A behavior. The ministry had approved me. My church needed to. So my pastor, my church was basically going to be my sending agency. So they also needed to approve me. And so the ministry and Lakeland had conversations, but they kept asking me, like, well, how's the fundraising going? And I'm like, oh, okay. I wasn't doing any part of that. And so I remember having a conversation with my pastor, who was a great friend of mine. Again, another kind of gentleman, even this day, I would say is kind of a spiritual father. It's hard. I don't want to say that my dad wasn't, but it's just a different way than what my biological dad was. So these guys filled some other roles, again, with me living in Michigan. And so Larry, I remember at one point calling me into his office, and we were having conversations about this and that, and it was all going well. And he asked about, the support raising. And I'm like, well, it's going all right. And he's like, have you even written a letter yet? And I'm like, no. He's like, have you talked to anybody? And I'm like, no. I'm like, quite honestly, now, the ministry was sending me down on a budget that was woefully inadequate. I mean, ridiculously small. Knowing what I know now, I would never send anybody on a missions field on what they were having me raise. So it was less. I mean, basically, I was going to make $8,400 a year. So I was moving from a 6-figure salary to a 4-figure salary. My bank account was enough to keep me on the field for years. And so I knew I had this in my back pocket. I'm like, I don't really have to ask for anything, because I already have enough to keep myself there. And so I actually said that to my pastor at one point. And Larry's just like, if you don't do this, he's like, if God is calling you, He will provide for you. And he's like, I'm not saying this from a money standpoint or for you keeping what's in your account. He's like, I know this is going to be hard for you to hear, but he's like, I'm telling you as a true friend and as a brother, he's like, this is not a money issue for you. This is a pride issue for you. And that stung a little bit. But looking back, 100% true. I mean, pride is something that God continues to work on me with. And at that point, Larry told me, he's like, I've watched you give away thousands of dollars at a crack. He's like, but I've never watched you have to humble yourself to say, I need somebody else's support. And he's like, if you don't do it, I won't approve you and you won't go. And all of a sudden that hit hard. And so I'm struggling, and we moved into January. I still did not have, it's early January. I'm supposed to leave in the middle of March, and I still haven't written a support letter. And I remember just having that moment where it was coming, and I'm like, finally just broke down before God, and I'm like, I know I need to do this. You know that this is incredibly hard for me. But just shared the story, shared what was going on, shared why I felt, and it got to the point where I'm like, writing the letter and asking people wasn't even a hard part. It was the asking. It was saying, I'm not sufficient in myself, which was a hard thing for me to do at that point. But once I got to that point, then the amazing thing was I sent that out, and in 2 weeks' time, enough money came in to keep me on the field for 3 years. 2 weeks. I've known missionaries who have taken 2 to 3 years to end up with. Now, again, what I was raising was ridiculously small. So in some regards, you're like, well, that was to be expected. But it floored me. And it also just broke my heart at times. I remember being at church at one point, finishing up, and I'm going out to my car after church, and I had 2 little kids. They had an older brother who was in my middle school ministry, but I had a 3-year-old girl and a 5-year-old boy who were siblings come running out, chasing me to my car. They're like, Mr. Chris, Mr. Chris. And they chase me down, and they hand me this jug of coins, and they're like, we want you to have our Jesus money. There was like maybe $40 in there. Just wrecked me. Just wrecked me. But in a good way. Because God's like, even in this, I will use this. And so all of a sudden, I'm like, we're early February. I've got funds that I need. I have the support of my church. Middle of March comes. we were wrapping things up. I had announced at Pfizer very early in January. So my boss, who, had at one point, we were working through that whole vacation thing, and he's like, hey, you go. So I remember having my resignation, because that was another thing I was not looking forward to, is I'm like, well, how do I leave there? And so I had written up this resignation, but kept it very vague and just said, look, I'm happy to give 2 weeks or whatever you need, but I also understand this is a secure facility. If you need to walk me out today, I'm okay with this, but didn't explain anything. So it's a Monday morning. I've been there since Sunday night. Fred comes in, and so I just hand him, the envelope with this, and he's like, hey, thanks. I'm like, you should probably read that. And so I went back to my office, and I hear him yell for me. He's like, come here. And so I come back into his office, and he is clearly upset, angry upset that I was resigning. And he's like, I'm so sick of your position, not necessarily me, but my position was a notorious one for somebody who had a scientific background to get some management experience. Headhunters would call, offer you more money, and people would leave. So that's what he kind of assumed was happening. And he's like, you're not even going to give me a chance to counter? He's like, I really want to be able to counter. He's like, we've put a lot into your development, and he's like, we want to continue with that. And I kind of tongue-in-cheek, I'm like, you can counter, but there's no way you can meet the fringe benefits. This wasn't even thinking, and he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, I'm not leaving for the reasons you think I'm leaving. He's like, well, I don't understand. I said, I'm not going to another chemical company. I said, I'm taking position as a missionary and doing that. He's like, really? And I said, yeah. He's like, well, sit down, let's talk for a minute. So we talked for about 45 minutes about what were going on. Fred became one of my supporters. And so it was a great thing. He's like, well, when do you plan on leaving? And I'm like, well, at this point, I'm hoping by mid-March. The 17th was when we were supposed to leave. And he's like, well, can you work up until, the week before? And I'm like, well, I don't know if I can wait that long. But I did. I ended up working at Pfizer until 2 weeks before I headed to the missions field, which was great. That gave me a good chance to finish up some things there. But then just, the process of saying goodbye, there was a lot of, I didn't understand all of that. Didn't have necessarily the tools. Not sure that I did it the correct way, but saying goodbye to kids who'd been in my youth program for years, and that was very hard. Saying goodbye to a church that when I started with that church, there were 40 of us, and by the time I was leaving, there was about 1,000, and I had grown with them to where I probably knew 75% of the church at that point. So there were all these relationships. And so that was a big part. My parents coming up for, the last 4 or 5 days before I left, and to say goodbye to them was a challenge. And so, but same point, very exciting. The Hope College team went down, spent a week with them working in Montego Bay, just like a regular missions trip before transitioning. And so that was a great send-off. I mean, worshiping with them every night, being with them during the course of a day was just amazing. And then saying goodbye to them on that Friday night and then driving to the Deaf Village with a couple of the other missionaries. And then that transition, it was really cool, but it was also a point where I really needed God because it was radically different. Going from a place where I have community of hundreds of people and close relationships to living on the side of a mountain. And at that point, we didn't have any deaf residents. So there was a missionary family of 4 and another single missionary and myself. And for a few weeks, Scott was still there, and he was the guy that I was replacing. And so he kind of helped in that transitional walk. But yeah, all of a sudden there's like 6 of us living on the side of that mountain, a handful of day staff, and that became my new world. And that was really pretty different.
So what was it at the time then?
So it was the Deaf Village. But we were still in kind of the building process. And so we knew what the goal was. And so what people see today with the deaf adults and their families living there, that was the plan. It was still in the works. And so it was started in the kind of early 90s, just a piece of property. And again, we had certain buildings up, but a lot of it was hosting groups in from the States. And so that was one of my primary focuses, was working with those groups. And so we would have probably, even back then, 20, maybe 25 teams a year that would come in, anywhere in size from a dozen people to almost 150. And I would work with them. And then when I wasn't doing that, then a lot of times I'd be over at the school at Knockpatrick, hanging out with kids, learning sign language, spending time with folks over there, developing those relationships. Because what I found is that at the village, it was interesting. Because again, remember when I said part of the reason I couldn't do chemistry was I needed that social component. So the other single missionary and I, Cheryl was a nice person, but we were just too different. I mean, and she already had established connections. She'd been there for 3 years. And so it was never like we had this like super close relationship. The family, my boss, like defined introvert, almost reclusive. And so Tracy was not a people person whatsoever. Joy was a little bit more, but they'd already been there for a dozen years. I think 10 at that point. So they had kind of some established connections. So the ones I actually became closest with were the 2 teenage kids, because I would tutor them in math and science because they were homeschooled, and mom was not big on that. So all of a sudden having somebody with that background. So I tutored them in math and science. I tutored a couple of the students who were Jamaican. We had a couple of folks at the Knockpatrick school. One of them wanted to do pre-med. So again, tutoring in chemistry and calculus and things like that. And so all of a sudden was tying back in with that student thing. But that relationally, that was my relationship component if we didn't have teams there. And I'm like, for a 30-year-old guy, that your closest connections are with, a handful of teenagers who are anywhere from 13 to 16, we were just at different points in life. There wasn't a lot of feeding back into me. So that became one of my chief struggles early on, was figuring out what to do with that. Now, again, when I got down there in March, by the time we would hit early May, it was like groups nonstop. So from beginning of May through mid-August, there was not a free day in there. It was just group after group after group. So that was great, kept you busy. Middle of August into September hit, and everything stopped, and that's when it became just that. And that's where I found some of my first struggles on the field to really, really start to set in. Of that questioning was, what do I do now that I don't have kind of those components that I had here in the States building back into me?
Yeah, so super isolating, not having people investing in you, not having a church like you had experienced in such a cool, healthy way for all those years. Yeah, help us understand a little bit more of that struggle, the cross-cultural stuff.
The cross-cultural,
practical stuff, all of it.
So some of that really kind of set in, and it was something that I realized, because even looking from like a deaf ministry standpoint, I'd done a couple of short-term trips down there, and that was one thing. So on that initial short-term trip, and then I did a solo trip back in the fall just to kind of be down there on my own and kind of clarify that call. But even then, I didn't understand the longevity. So when I first signed up, I had signed that I would be there at least a year, and my thoughts were at least 2. But then I would say I was probably in 4 to 5 months, and things really started to clarify. I had been warned by some folks who did missions training that Jamaica was a hard place for missionaries. Part of the reason being is you're not far from the U.S. My flight from Chicago down is like 4.5 hours. So it's not, I can make the West Coast in about the same length of time. And so you're close to the U.S. English is the official language. So even though patois is spoken, you still see and hear English consistently. You see a lot of things that were normal to Americans. You see KFC and Burger King, and it's just, there's a lot of normal, what you would look at and go, okay, well, this is very American feeling. And so your expectation, I think, in a lot of ways is that it's going to be like what we did in the States. And what I realized about 3 to 4 months in is that is not the case. The culture is very different. There are a lot of dissimilarities. And then when you get into the deaf culture, even more so. So that was where all of a sudden I'm like transitioning and knowing this is going to be more career. And at that point really was thinking this was going to be a life calling for me. And so as I'm processing that and going through, like I said, it became very busy for a season, and that took a lot of that focus. And again, you're dealing with a lot of Americans, but then as you move into that fall and that church was just different. And finding people to connect with at the same way was different. And being at the school and trying to help understand of what my position was there and working with deaf students and whatnot, I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is really different. And what you keep pouring into people and pouring into people and pouring into people. And all of a sudden we hit the fall and my vessel was empty. I remember hitting a point, it's probably October. So Cheryl, Joy, who was a mom, and then the 2 girls, Megan and Jess, they were all going off for this women's retreat. So that left just Tracy and I. So Tracy was my boss, just the 2 of us on property. So Friday afternoon, we finish up the work day. And again, it's just us and the day staff because we don't have teams or anything. Tracy sees me as he's leaving the office, and he's like, all right, I've got this and this. I'm going to be working in my workshop this weekend. Normally on Friday nights, we would get together as missionaries and do pizza and watch, some VHS movie or whatnot. That was just kind of our missionary thing. He's like, we're not doing anything on Friday. And he's like, in fact, He's like, unless you're missing a limb and going to bleed to death, I don't expect to see you till Monday morning. That was pretty much where we left it. And I'm like, okay. Which in and of itself, not a huge deal. But again, I'm like at this point to where I'm like, I'm just drained. From basically September on, there just wasn't anything. So in my off time, I was reading. And in fact, after teams finished, within the first, I think it was 36 days, I read 30 books. Because there was nothing else to do apart from work. So I was working or I was reading, and I would walk. I would walk probably 10 miles a day, and on the weekends, I would just go out and hike locally to see. So I might even walk 20, 25 miles on a Saturday just because there was nothing else to do. There was no TV. There was no radio. We were still using a satellite phone, so there was no calling anybody. I mean, that was $8 a minute to call the States. And so when $700 a month is your take home, you're not making phone calls. So there's just nothing to do. And so we hit that Friday night, and looking back at it now, I'm like, I was probably dealing with some clinical depression. Didn't know it. Just felt sad, but got to that point. So it's Friday night, and I needed to talk to somebody. I just needed to talk to somebody. And so I take it back. So we were beyond the satellite phone. We had just had phone systems in. So I knew that we could now make phone calls. So I went to one of the other buildings where I could get to a phone. It was still $2.50 a minute, so it was going to be expensive. But I start to make a phone call. So I tried to call my parents. No answer. I tried to call my brother, which is saying a lot that I'm trying to call my brother. I mean, that competitive thing. No answer. I tried to call my grandparents. No answer. I start calling pastors and friends, youth group kids. I'm like, every phone number I have, no answer, no answer, no answer, no answer. And this is where all of a sudden that spiritual warfare component kicks in, because at this point, I start hearing in my heart this conversation. And the conversation went something along this lines. It's like, gosh, just think of all the things you've given up to serve God. One of the key components of you is you're a relational being, and you gave up all of these relationships. And now when you need it most, God's turned his back on you. Nobody's there for you. He's like, you just need to talk to somebody. And he's like, it got to the point where in my mind, not only was everybody out on a Friday night having fun and doing stuff, in my mind, even knowing that I'm calling people from anywhere from Ohio to Michigan to Chicago, they were all together Friday night at a local football game. I know this is not even physically possible, but that's where this was leading. It got to the point where I've now gone through probably 40 names, didn't get any, and I'm circling back through. It was somewhere between the 50th and 60th phone call. I finally got a hold of somebody from my church. And so Marty, who had been paired with me on that initial trip, I reached his home, and his wife, Kay, answered the phone. And so I'm like, hey, Kay, da-da-da-da. And she's like, Chris. She's like, where are you? And I'm like, Jamaica. She's like, oh, my word. She's like, you're in Jamaica? She's like, we're so honored. Out of all the people you could call, you would choose us. I didn't have the heart to go, Kay, you're like 55th. Now, this is the second time I've tried you. But she's like, well, Marty's not home right now. She's like, do you just want to try back tomorrow? Or she's like, or what? I'm like, no, if you're good to talk for a little bit until he gets, she's like, it'll only be probably another 5 or 10 minutes. I'm like, let's just chat till he gets there. And so we have this conversation. Marty picks up. We're talking, and Marty and I are 5 minutes in, and he's just like, so what's up? And because he knew something. And so I just kind of go through, and I'm like explaining what was on. And his question was, he's like, so do you need to come home? And I'm like, well, yeah, I'll be home at Thanksgiving. I'm going to come home for a short period. You know, I had a missions conference I was going to speak at. He's like, no, I'm asking you, do you need to come home? He's like, if you need to come back, he's like, I'm on a plane tomorrow. And I'm like, no. I'm like, I know I'm supposed to be here. This is just one of these things. I just needed somebody to talk to. And what it clarified for me was I'm like, I had this support that if the wheels came off the bus, there was a safety net that was there, and I had people who loved me and cared for me. But God had also placed this call, and I knew what the call was. I wasn't questioning the call, but this was just one of those points where I'm like, on the field, I think a lot of times you end up with this challenge that I'm like, there are factions that don't want us serving God in that capacity. There just really are. I've gained a whole new perspective of kind of that spiritual warfare and understanding that while God in heaven celebrates when we're out doing what we're supposed to do, there's a whole other faction that doesn't want that and will challenge us at every crossroads. And that was one of those points. That was probably one of the lowest times in my life. And it was good to know that, again, God, in that moment, gave me what I needed, but it was a struggle. And that also helped to clarify that I'm like, I think in that moment it actually clarified for me too that I'm like, if I wanted to do that long term, it wasn't going to necessarily be something that I saw myself doing solo. And that was some place where I think I really started praying along the lines of having a helpmate, someone to be a partner in that walk.
Man, that makes total sense. That isolating feeling would lead to depression. And I mean, we were talking earlier before we were recording about how common wild stories are. We've got this U of M coach going on right now as we're recording this.
Correct.
But we were talking about how it happens in missions all the time. And it makes sense that you're in an extremely stressful situation. You're isolated from your church family, which is not what we're designed. We're not designed to be isolated from the church family. No. It's literally against our design. And you're feeling the weight and repercussions and challenges of that, and then that builds up over time in people's lives, and then you've got all this pressure from supporting churches sending you money or having expectations, or your organization feeling that way as well, and it just forces you to bury that a little more and try to keep pushing on, and that slowly builds up over time. And so I think it's helpful for us as the church to hear some of these stories and some of these real challenges, because it just makes sense. If we were to actually take the time to put ourselves in your shoes and how difficult that is to be isolated, then I think we would hopefully be more like Marty, like have more Martys out there of us who are trying to reach out and be connected.
Well, and I think that's huge, because like even now when we talk about it, I'm like, you know, when there are things going on, we talk about a lot of the missions letters and things like that where we're like, you know, it's that whole sunshine and happiness and smiles and conversions, because that's what people want to hear. Yeah. You know, well, how many people have come to the Lord, and how many, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm like, I laugh when, you know, because we support missionaries 2.5 years, and I laugh when I'll read through, you know, the quarterly or monthly or whatever, you know, time frame those are coming out, and you read those letters, and they're all the same. They're all hitting those highlights, and you're like, there's nothing wrong with that, but you know that that's just such a small piece of that story that there's a whole nother reality. And it's having someone or a small group of someones that you can be transparent with. And sometimes those are pastors, sometimes it's from your church, but sometimes it's somebody entirely different. And at the various times of being on the field, I've been blessed to have groups. Ren and I, either as a married couple, have had some folks like that, or we even each had somebody who's been single. Like I've got a group of guys that I know I could go to and talk to and just be vulnerable and be transparent and say, okay, so in addition to that, and at that point, again, being single, knowing that there were some folks who, one, were there as a support, but two, that were there as accountability. There's all these components. And so, I mean, I would challenge anybody, if you're listening to this and you have a relationship with somebody who's serving on the field or in some sort of role, because like you said, a lot of churches, it's not fair to say a lot of churches. So there's varying levels with the churches within the groups that are supporting you. So like Grace has a very significant role with me and with our family. Not all of our supporting churches have that. So what I share within this church and with individuals within this church is a lot of times not different, but more than what I will share. And it's important to have that because, like you said, there's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of stress, and a lot of times you don't feel that you can share that openly.
And I would say from our side of things, the church's side of things, I think those newsletters that are super vague and don't actually get into details and are all the same, I think a lot of that is our fault as the church. I think the missionary is, there's some level on the missionary side where you could be more intentional to be vulnerable at times, but in a lot of ways they're doing that because of their experiences with us as the church.
Correct.
GBC is not excluded from this. Like we're humans, so we can tend to do this within our church as well. But I've seen it also with a lot of churches, and growing up as a missionary kid, we've seen it with supporting churches all the time, where you say one little vulnerable thing or you say one little reality and everybody goes berserk because they've got this box to put you in.
Yes.
And if you're a real human and going through real struggles, it's all right, we're throwing you out. We don't want to support you then. We're just going to support these other people who seem to be all polished.
Correct.
And the reality is, if they seem to be polished, that should probably be a little bit of a warning flag in some ways.
Correct.
And so I think it's really important for us as the church, as individuals within the church, and as church leaders, but as church as a whole, to be aware that
100%.
Missionaries are real people, then there's these crazy pressures, and it's on us. I mean, Paul talks about it with his supporters. He's saying, you are taking part in the fruit of this ministry through your support, through your care, through your love, not just sending money, but visiting, by sending letters and food and all these different things. And people, like relationships to help spur him up, to keep him going, to encourage him to fill this need that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that's really helpful for us to hear and take seriously and consider, man, how can we, in a very practical way, take part in what God's doing in the world through being people who will listen and try to understand and reach out and take the initiation steps, because now it doesn't cost us $2 or $8 to call somebody overseas.
Right.
It's very accessible.
Yes. And so that was just one of those pieces, especially on that first kind of 3 years on the missions field, that I realized was going to be a bigger component, was needing to have that relational connection, having that relational support, being very intentional. And like I said, back at that point, I mean, the first 6 months we're looking at $8 a minute to call back. So it just didn't happen. I guess as we rolled into that fall was when we got to the point it's $2.50. So you're like, okay, well, more reasonable. And I would call back and talk to my parents twice a month, about an hour each time, and that would chew up half of my monthly support. I mean, that was $350 for those 2 phone calls.
Wow.
And then we chuckled because I'm like, we would write letters. And that's another thing that even in that, I'm like, back in the day, you think about writing to missionaries, and it's like, it used to take on average about 2 months. So from the time somebody would write to when I would get it, it was about 2 months or so. And within the first few months, maybe the first 4 or 5 months I was on the field, was consistent. I was getting letters from a bunch of different people and whatnot, and those just kind of eventually to where it was like my mom and 2 other people, sending me stuff that at least you would kind of get those. And so, but during that time, God opened up some other relational components, and I did start making more relationships on the field, and you start getting in and tying, which is really the way it was supposed to be. And I said, and in some ways, I think that was actually hugely beneficial because it helped me to tie into my local community. And it's a process. And that's one of the things I've seen with some other missionaries who I've seen come on the field. We talk about a lot of the benefits of what it is now, and I think they're huge, and they're great as a component. So we think about things like FaceTime and WhatsApp, and I chuckle now as I'm sharing, my story back in the day of what it costs. And like, we have missionaries who are heading down in Jamaica in January, and we're super excited because, we've got a Starlink down there, and it's 250 megs download now. And I'm like, there's no roughing it in that, but but they're like, oh, well, that allows us to stay connected with community, and you have phone calls and you can do all these things, which is great. But I've also seen that be kind of a catch-22 in the fact that sometimes then people struggle to leave the community that is safe and connected here, and they don't tie in as well with their local community because it still allows you to keep a foot back here. So even managing now, relationships and all this, there's always different components. So you have to kind of work those out, and each one of those has its own kind of nuance to it. So anyway, that's just kind of where that was for that season. But again, God continued to open up doors and eventually did provide a helpmate through that.
Yeah, so tell us about that.
All right, so how about that? So interestingly, because people talk about, Ren and I said, the unique thing about that whole relationship, Ren joined my sending church 2 weeks after I left. So we had never overlapped before I left for the field. So I had been gone for 2 weeks. She comes in, and she'd been at the church, I don't know, maybe 6 months, and I think ended up on staff at that point. So her background was culinary, so she was still working as a chef at a restaurant in Saugatuck, actually a pretty high-end restaurant. But it just wasn't enough to kind of make ends meet, so it was also working as an admin staff at the church. So kept hearing about, me, but we had never overlapped. And so it wasn't until I was actually coming back to speak at the church at one point for a missions conference is when we first kind of got connected. And so now how we actually, the first time we met, there was some discrepancy in that story, as the case always is. And so coming back for this missions conference, I was supposed to send back, we had like 3 of our missionaries coming back, and so they wanted like this brief write-up and a picture, and they were making up like some kind of like prayer cards, but also like Bible inserts so people could have them in your Bible and you'd think to pray for the missionaries and whatnot. But when they were requesting them was during the midst of like our insanely busy time. And so that was when they first asked, and I just didn't have the capacity, and so it got put off, and eventually it totally falls off your radar. So now all of a sudden it's like October, and Ren and I are like, I'd gotten a couple of things from her, but I ended up calling back, and again, we're making full circle back to my friend Marty. So Marty has now stepped into an executive pastor's role for the church. And so he's helping to coordinate my trip back, and I'm talking to him, and I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm going to be back in 2 weeks. I never got the stuff sent in. At this point, I don't know how to get it to you. I'm like, can I just bring it in? Is there enough time? I'll be there midweek. Will you guys have time to print everything up before? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, oh, it's a rough way. I mean, first time I get to meet the new admin, and I'm like 5 months behind on getting information. And he's like, oh, so you've never met Renee? Because she went by Renee back in. And I'm like, no. So he yells out into the general office. He's like, hey, Renee, you finally get to meet Chris, our missionary from Jamaica. And she's like, we've met. So, and I had said, I'm like, we haven't met. So Marty's response, the way he translates that for her is he's like, he says you're totally not memorable because he doesn't recall that at all. And I'm like, that is not at all what I said. But I literally don't know anything about her. So long and short was, yes, we had met. So when I had been up once before, she had actually joined the like single adults group that used to be the one that I had led. And so on a Sunday that I had been there after church, like the year before, that small group took me out for lunch. She came along. And so she was like one of a handful of folks, but there's like 25 people. She's like maybe one of 4 or 5. And she maintains that she had asked me a number of questions, but once we actually dig down in this, she's super introverted typically. She doesn't appear it so much, but I'm like, there's no way. And she's like, well, maybe I didn't ask as many questions as I thought. I'm like, yeah, you sat there and observed the conversation, but you were there. So that's technically when we first met. But it was during that trip was when we first connected, and just kind of through that kind of project and then some opportunity, it started us conversing back and forth, just kind of from a church standpoint. But it was just fun. I there wasn't anything initial on that, but eventually she was coming down on a missions trip, and because she was helping to coordinate all of that, it started us talking back and forth, mostly email, instant messaging for anybody that's old enough to remember IMing. So doing that, and just through those conversations, this is taking a very long and in-depth story and shortening it up because it's really a long story, but God really opened up for both of us. Both of us knew we were pursuing something, not necessarily with each other, but wanting to have that person in our life. And as we did that, by the time she actually ended up on that trip, we had an inkling. And so started to have some conversations of what it would look like to, I termed a courtship, because it's not really dating when you live in two different countries and aren't seeing each other and whatnot. But because of some things in her past, it was actually the way it needed to happen. She fully will acknowledge, she's like, if we'd been in the same place, she's like, then we could have fallen into that normal, go see a movie, go do this. And she's like, I could hide behind activity and not have in-depth conversation that she needed to have, to where because of living in that point, we needed to have the conversations. And even in that, somebody's like, well, what did you do with phone bills? I'm like, uniquely, about 3 months before we started our whole courtship, there was this thing that was introduced into Jamaica on the missions field. It was called the Yap Jack, which was a precursor to voice over IP. So all of a sudden I could use an internet connection, which was sometimes dicey, but it moved my phone calls to about 10 cents a minute. So all of a sudden I'm like, we could talk to our heart's content. And so we spent a ton of time having long conversations and having just in-depth conversations, which is really what we kind of needed, and to pursue that. And I had really committed that I'm like, I didn't really, like from high school on, it didn't necessarily, for a variety of reasons, believe in dating. I thought serial dating led to serial relationships. Even after marriage, I watched friends that I knew who had had multiple divorces, and I'm like, I just saw a lot of that pattern, and that's not something I wanted to follow. So this kind of helped fit a role for me, that I wanted something that was very intentional and that I put before God. And I said, I'm trusting you to bring somebody in my life. And he did. He brought somebody who was different than I was, but very much complimented me. And then when Ren visited the missions field, she actually felt called to Jamaica in a sense long before we ever started pursuing anything. And so she figured that she would be back there. And so God kind of brought us both to the same point, but together. So if anybody's interested, grab me for lunch at some point, and I'll fill you in on a lot more details, because honestly, I think it's a pretty amazing story.
Yeah.
But that's in a nutshell.
So how long was that?
It was basically a year from the time we kind of reconnected at that, like, I won't say first met, but at that missions thing, to where we were married just over a year later. And that was, well, a few weeks ago, we celebrated our 23rd anniversary. So
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. So then you guys get married.
Yep.
And she obviously moves down with you.
No. So at that point, we were ministry required that we take a year off. You had to take that first year, focus on the relationship, which I 100% support. If you're within your first year of marriage, at least if I had anything to do with it, I would never send you to the missions field. Horrible idea, I think. I mean, there's so much, like you said, there's different pressures, there's that spiritual attack, and within that first year, you need to solidify your relationship. And I think you need to do it in a place where you're surrounded by culture and by community that you know, versus trying to do that where there's all of these expectations and things. So the ministry had that policy. Plus, we knew that we would have to redeputize. There's no way you could live together as a couple on $8,400 a year. And so we knew we would have to spend a year. And during that time, God closed the door on us going back. And some of that was a couple of things. There were some couple of individuals within the ministry that I struggled with some leadership decisions that they were making. And so I said, in good conscience, and it was hard for Ren especially because she didn't necessarily have same perspective that I did. She just knew that I was saying, no, we can't go back. And that was a hard thing, but she also trusted me in that. And so as we were processing that, God just kind of closed that door. But then interestingly, within that next year or so, I guess it was probably just a year and a half, both individuals that I struggled with some of the decisions they were making were both removed from the ministry. Not necessarily by the ministry and for those reasons. It was different reasons, but they were both taken out of those positions. Both of them restored to good positions, and I'm actually on good terms with both of them, so that's all well and good. But that opened up, and then right after that point, I was approached by the board of directors because we were still going back, and I would take teams back to serve, but I was just doing like a 1 week trip here or there. And Ren and I went back together on a couple of those things. And so during that point, then the board of directors approached me and asked if I would serve on the board of directors. And so that became kind of that next phase. And so we, right after we were married, we weren't on the field together. And then a few years down the road, Caitlin came along. And so that changes things up. And so as we had approached that.
So you lived in West Michigan for those 3 years. Then Caitlin came along 3 years in.
Well, let's see. So we were married in 2002, and Caitlin was born in 2006. So, it was just like 3.5 years. So had gone back, initially went back to Pfizer, and they were acquiring Upjohn and Pharmacia, so they couldn't actually hire me in full time, but brought me in as a temp at that point with the intent of hiring me full time once that process was done, and that was the intent. 3 weeks after I started, corporate announced they were closing it down. And so I was there to help with some of that because I didn't want to move. Our options were either the East Coast or the West Coast. We were newly married, didn't have connections either place, and we're like, that's just not something we wanted to do. And so actually ended up back at the church and accepted a position as a youth pastor at that role. So I was doing that. Even that lasted for a couple of years, and the church was going through some transition and eventually shut down. So I ended up back in a different tech job. But then, like I said, Caitlin came along, and so we were kind of doing that, but still serving as on the board. And then as we rolled in, Caitlin was about 4, and I was doing more and more kind of on the side with the ministry. And at that point, the board of directors asked if I would accept the VP's role stateside. Our main office was in West Virginia. We wanted to open up an office in Michigan, which is currently the office. But as we were looking to do that, they said, would you consider coming back full-time and taking the VP's role? And so we did that as supported missionaries here in the States. But had always said if God opened the door again and asked us to go, we would definitely be willing to go. And so I did that from 2010 until 2017. And it was in kind of late 2016 that the president of the ministry approached us and said, here's some things going on in Jamaica, and I could really just picture you guys in a role there. Would you consider praying about it? And we did. And again, everything lined up, and we felt really definitively called back. And so started walking that, and it was at the end of 2017. The very end, 2 weeks before. So basically 2018, transitioning back to Jamaica.
Okay. So bouncing around different roles there.
Yep.
Married for a little while here in the States in different roles. Tell us a little bit about how cool that was having Caitlin, having your daughter here in the States for
years. Caitlin, ton of fun. And I had always wanted a daughter, wanted a daddy's girl. Initially was, now that we're going through the teenage and early, she turns 20 here in a handful of weeks. That has changed. But just remember, again, when she was little and whatnot, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Still do. It's different.
Yeah.
I mean, we've gone through those different phases. And so, has been fun watching her grow up. Has been interesting because we've always kind of looked at some of those things. And some of the things now, as we've moved down the road and looked back at some of the things, we're like, didn't know how prophetic some of those were. We used to chuckle because, like, the kid could change on a dime, go from, like, happy laughing to just, like, hands clenched and, like, little fists of rage or, crying at a moment. And so we used to jokingly call her our little bipolar baby. So then when she actually was diagnosed bipolar later in life, we're like, oof, that hits differently now. But that's just some of the challenges that I'm like, you just, as a parent, you don't know. And there's some of those things that I'm like, again, watching her come through school and some of the challenges, not a bad way. I mean, intellectually, she's always been ahead of that curve, but seeing some of those challenges that we're like, oh, well, wow, what's going on here? And then seeing how that played out on the field. She's had an interesting perspective, and I'm guessing one that you would resonate with. I mean, growing up as an MK can be a challenge. And we've looked at a number of the things that she has experienced over the years, and I give her a lot of credit. By the time she's hit her late teens, there's been a lot of things that she's experienced that most adults would never have experienced. I mean, growing up as a third culture kid, from the time she was 12 until she was 18, basically 20. I mean, the last few years, there's been this back and forth to deal with health issues. But by and large, I would say, she spent 8 of her last 10 years on the field. So it's been an interesting component. But again, being a dad is cool. Arguably, in some ways, harder than being a missionary or anything else. But it's still a very cool thing.
Yeah, that is cool. That's cool to hear that. And with you guys have had such unique, she's had such unique health challenges and all that kind of stuff that you're mentioning, and going down as a 12-year-old, I'm sure that would be challenging because she kind of understood life here.
Correct.
Had a chance to maybe have a little bit of roots here on stateside and then having to uproot that. I'm sure that'd be really a challenging thing that really just necessitates a lot of trust in the Lord, it sounds like. So
It does.
Yeah, but that's cool. Cool to hear that. So you guys go back down. She's 12.
Yep.
Ren's first time, full time.
Correct.
You've had a couple years of experience down there. I guess I want to quickly, just for time's sake, hit the pause button on the story.
Okay.
And just tell us, we haven't really talked about CCCD yet.
Sure.
So tell us, broad 50,000 foot view, what's the goal of CCCD?
Yep.
And
I think our mission statement sums it up pretty well. The goal is to reach, teach, and nurture the deaf. And so that's one of the things that when I got down there that I think God really opened up my eyes of, having done student ministry here and then going down in a lot of our, like at least our initial ministry, being involved with students, you kind of have this mindset of, I have these gifts and I have these skills and I'm going to be able to take that right. Nope. Guess again. What you think is going to work, and when you hit the missions field, those various cultures and all of those things, the things that we know that we bring to the table and whatnot, usually don't translate. And that became very evident to me. I continue to learn daily about how different these are. And so when we look at it, CCCD has been around a long time, and I've shared because it's been interesting even having conversations with other missionaries about their experience, because a lot of times you're moving into a culture which still has some similarities. You might have to learn a foreign language and you learn about the differences between, how things work within a culture, whether that's Europe or Asia or whatever. So you have to pick up those things, and there are different components of that. But in some regard, you're still going into a culture that's kind of established, and you're taking God's word and God's truth, and you're helping put it in that context and sharing that with somebody. With the deaf culture, it's a long play. we're going out, and you're first, you've got to find people, and you have to identify them. And so when you find them, it's, I guess in a sense, it's a blank canvas, because you cannot share the gospel with them yet. Why? They don't have the tools to understand it. And so when we talk about it, we say, to reach, we have to go out and we have to find them, and then teach. Well, why do we have to teach? Because they don't have the components to understand. They could, like all of us, we can look at Romans and we know nature itself attests to God. And so I think inherently they're able to look around, and I think there's some piece of us that understands that there is someone greater than us that has created this. I just think that's inherent within us. But beyond that, there's nothing. There's nothing to identify that we're sinful, that we've rebelled against that. There's nothing to identify that God made a way back for us through Jesus. I mean, Romans will walk us through all of this, but for a deaf child, they don't have that. So we have to now teach. We have to give a language, which is a long process, and then we have to use and build on that language to give them an education. And so that finally you get to that point to where incrementally you start weaving in the gospel. And it starts young and it works its way up. I mean, each part, it's like everything else, you just give pieces. And so as I've been a part of that, thinking about that whole component of CCCD, I'm more amazed every time I think about it. Because again, this is not my background. I didn't have it in education. I didn't have it in like sign language. There was nothing in my history that said you would be a good fit for deaf ministry. But God's like, I can still use you. And he keeps just showing me components and aspects that I'm floored with how he does this and how he works through us. But so you give them that language, you give them that education, and then you share the gospel and allow the Spirit to work in their heart and accept that. And then we start that discipleship component, because from that point, then it starts to look like other pieces. You disciple, and the reason you disciple is so then they can go back to their own community. Because far better for them, far deeper. I used to laugh years and years ago. I would go down, and because I could sign, and when we first started JDV in the deaf community, we first had the deaf coming in. I was the initial not deaf pastor. I was the pastor for the deaf church. So we would have folks come in, and so I would be teaching and whatnot. Well, then when I left the field and would come back with groups, or I'm coming back when I worked as CCCD, as the VP and whatnot, I would come back. And at that point, we actually had one of our graduates who had gone on to seminary and had been ordained, who was now leading the deaf church. And so like I would be back, and on Thursday we would have deaf fellowship at the church. And so Damien's like, oh, come and speak. And so I would work everything out and practice my sign, and I would come in and do 45 minutes. And, I'm trying to engage and see what they're doing. You get a few people that would head nod and this or that, and you're like, oh, okay. But out of like 35, 40 people there, you're getting a couple. And I've just spoke for 45 minutes. And then Damien would stand up and he's like, oh, let's thank Chris. And everybody would, deaf clap. And then he's like, well, let me help summarize. And in 5 or 7 minutes, he would take everything I said. And all of a sudden, like 90% of the group is head nodding. And you start to see realization. I'm like, why do you even bother having me come up here? Just you do this, because your grasp of the language and your grasp of the culture and the way you just changed my stories enough that it made sense. This is what we're shooting for, is to raise up other deaf who can reach their own community. And that's the play of CCCD, is like every place else, to train and build up deaf Christian leaders who can reach their own community and share the gospel at a level that we just can't. We have some very gifted people that have come through our ministry over the years, but even within that, we still have limitations. And so that's the 50,000-foot view of CCCD.
Yeah, that's such a cool, you mentioned the deaf church there, and Sheldon now being a pastor there. And
Sheldon's
Damien
another one, yep.
Being involved. And that idea of discipling them. So you're bringing them in, giving them a language, teaching them the gospel throughout the schooling process, trying to disciple them, and then also offering, ideally, the goal of offering them a church community, an ability to have a thriving relationship with the Lord through their church community, with Sheldon,
which is the nurture part.
Pastor,
yep,
that nurture portion. And then the one other thing alongside that, I guess, which I know is practically a big part, but I love how you were keeping it 50,000 foot view. That was super good. But the other practical part of trying to get them in jobs and all that kind of stuff
Absolutely.
as they graduate, you know,
Yeah.
you have multiple campuses just dedicated toward that. You mentioned
Right.
the village. That's what the village, that's
Yep.
what the purpose of the Jamaican Deaf Village is, JDV.
Yeah, that further development, not just spiritually, but as people.
Yeah.
And when we look at Jamaica, I mean, there are certain aspects of Jamaica. Family structure is one of them. I mean, it's definitely not what we're used to in the U.S. I mean, there's just the vast majority are not coming from married two-parent families. In fact, for most of our deaf who are on campus who are married and have families, they're first generation trying to figure out, and that's a strange place to be when you've got two deaf parents who have hearing children. You're trying to navigate all of that. You haven't had role models to show you and live out what it means to be a husband and a wife together. And so, you know, just trying to help, like from a practical standpoint, what does that look like? Helping them to discern what it is to live in community. All of these different components of just building into an individual. And like you said, then training and helping with job acquisition. And we do that both at JDV and at Montego Bay. That training aspect, because those are components too. We want you to be a functional part of society. So we don't discount that. I mean, now if you make me choose just one aspect, of course I'm going to go big picture and go, well, in the scheme of eternity, the next 70 to 80 years, I want you to succeed, and I want that to be as easy and productive for you as it can be. But if I have to sacrifice one for the other, then I'm going to shoot big picture and go, eternity. I want us to be in heaven together for eternity. And that requires knowing Jesus and having that relationship. But I don't think we're necessarily, most of the time, required to choose one or the other. It's a both and. And so at that point, we want to develop that spiritual discipleship, but also engage and equip you to become an active and productive member of not just the deaf community, but community as a whole.
And that's one of the things I like about CCCD a lot, that, you know, when I first started coming here, actually, we met, I was in college attending here, volunteering as I volunteered in kids and was just involved in the church. And you came and spoke, and you were talking about the gospel-centeredness of CCCD, and I had observed how it was very common in missions not to be centered on the gospel and to focus on just the physical side, like you're saying, the next 80 years. And I was kind of honestly rubbed wrong by how often that was talked about. I'm not GBC necessarily, just in general. And I heard you talk, and I was like, I got to go talk to this guy. So I actually got your contact info as a college kid, and we talked in the sanctuary a little bit. It was cool. But then even being here now in my role connected to you guys more, I've noticed more and more how common it is for people, you know, similar organizations in the sense that they're doing child sponsorships and they're doing, you know, caring for the needy in different ways, saying they're gospel-centered, saying they're Christian, but it's really just kind of a sign on the wall. It's like, we're going to do this good thing, and we're going to put John 3:16 on the wall and hope everybody gets saved through it. And the difference with CCCD is, no, actually our whole purpose is to get them to the gospel, that eternal big picture purpose of to present the gospel clearly to them so they can hear with their hearts and have an opportunity to believe, and then have an opportunity to grow and develop in their walk with the Lord and bring other deaf along in knowing Jesus. That as the heart and as the center of CCD, to me, is the game changer, because you still have a wild amount of structure that's helping them physically for the next 80 years.
Sure.
A wild amount of structure. But you're saying, here's our goal, is eternity, the eternal, their souls, their eternal suffering is what we're shooting to solve. But on the way, we love them. Right. We love them because we're Christian. We love them as people, as image bearers, and also now believers as brothers and sisters. And because of that, of course, we're going to help them with their physical needs and try to equip them in those ways. But that's not necessarily the goal. And I love how you guys talk about it and practically try to focus on that.
Yeah.
Super cool.
Well, and it's like everything else. It's like being church and everything. I mean, all of these compete for time, and there are times where you're just like, oof,
Yep.
how can I do? And there's always a need for people and whatnot. And I'm super excited. I mean, the young couple who's going down in January, they're not taking over everything that Ren and I are leaving. And they just can't. I mean, they're a young couple. I chuckled. Cameron shadowed me this past March for a couple of weeks. And while he was there, he celebrated his birthday. He turned 25. It was also the same week that I was celebrating 25 years of involvement with CCCD. So I'm like, I've been involved doing this as long as you've been alive. So they're not necessarily going to step in and do everything, but their focus is really on a lot of it is discipleship and relational ministry. And I'm excited about that opportunity, and not necessarily having everything else, because there were a lot of things that were on my plate that still needed to get done. But you're like, those were the practical aspects of running businesses and doing all of these other things. And I told Ren, I said, one of the things I felt I'm like convicted of even in the last couple of years is I'm like, really need to find some more time to have time with, especially the guys, and really challenge them, because there's times where it's just like, it's easy not to be involved. And I know GBCers, I'm like, I loved being down there with a group from Forge and seeing how the men were together and challenging each other. And I'm like, I wanted to see that kind of same thing happening in Jamaica. And talking to Ren, and I'm like, how can I create another? And she's like, what are you going to give up? And I'm like, well, there's really nothing I can give up. And she's like, I'm not denying that it's a need, but she's like, there's only so much. And I was like, so that's been one of the things that I think is a challenge with CCCD as well, as there's so many good things going on, but not to lose that focus. And we've had some great partners that have come up, watching another deaf church start in Kingston. So Ecclesia, which started up a couple of years ago. I'll call it CCCD adjacent. So with a lot of our students and stuff, but it's with another ministry called Harvest Call, which is the one who's partnered with us. And so seeing these things, and I'm like wanting to make sure that, again, we don't lose sight of the forest for the trees, and it's like, I appreciate that for CCCD. I know it's on our heart. And it's just, sometimes it's like, you just got to keep reminding yourself, let's not lose sight of the eternal for the immediate.
Yeah. So for the sake of time,
Yep.
We're gonna jump your story. I guess we could
It's
maybe
fine.
do another time to get these more recent years. But you I think you went up to 2017-ish, where you guys moved
Sure.
back.
2018,
You
yep.
filled a couple 2018, some different roles while you were there, and then recently you just came back to the States.
Correct.
And are back in this role that you mentioned in the beginning, which
Yep.
is VP
So-
of Advancement.
Yeah, advancement development.
Development.
So,
I
yeah,
keep saying advancement.
that's fine.
like
It's
one or the
basically
other.
all the same thing.
VP
um,
of Development.
Getting people engaged and raising money.
Yeah.
I mean, plain
Yeah.
and simple. So, yeah, I mean, the last 4 years, we talked about Kaylin's health, and we basically, during those 4 years, Ren and Kaylin spent a fair amount of time up here. And so dealing with both physical health and mental health issues. And so, and because GBC is a strong, you're basically sending church with us. So I don't know if people, but I'm like, we have kind of ceded authority for us there, and have had some really good conversations with staff members who have our best interests at heart. But about a little over about a year and a half ago, Caitlin was having some additional struggles. We'd already been up, and so we were to be taking a home assignment year to kind of help make sure she had what she needed. But we were still short missionary staff, which meant I spent another 6 months that year on the field. And it was during that time, had some real heart-to-hearts, Pastor Ty, Pastor Adam, Alex, you, having conversations, and just from a loving standpoint, being asked to think about, what does this look like? Not just for Kaylin, but for our family. Because during those 4 years, in essence, Ren and I have lived in separate countries for a cumulative of 2 years. And as a married couple, it's not necessarily the best thing to happen. So So as we approached that, and so last fall we were actually supposed to kind of be transitioning back. But Ren and I, that September, I came back after some being down there for the entire summer and whatnot. And we had seen some progress in Caitlin, but Ren and I were talking, and she's like, you realize if we move back, Caitlin has no alternative but to go with us. And if that happens, any progress she's made, we basically just yank the carpet out from underneath her. And I agreed. I'm like, I know that that's the case. And so we prayed and just said, we feel that God is going to have us here. Now, 2025, there was no plan B. So again, that was another 6 months of me in Jamaica and them here making that official transition. But as we rolled to the end of this past summer into August, September rolled around and I came back, and that was kind of that transition. And so officially October 1st, I accepted the position with the U.S. office to be the VP of development. And so it was, there was some hard aspects of that. I mean, for the last 8 years, I've known what my role is. I've known where I've been called. We love Jamaica. It was home. Still in some ways is home, but knew this was to be the case. And initially had some great, exciting stories to share. I mean, we're talking about one of them tomorrow, which is, like child sponsorship. I mean, we have all these new students coming in, and we have another lady who's taken over, who's looking to add, 200 students in the next couple of years. And so sharing those stories, and I'm like, okay, well, this gives me an opportunity to do something I do well. And then at the end of the month, there was, this hurricane that rolls through. And so I had a friend who challenged me, and he's like, I know that it's been a little bit of a struggle for you personally, meaning me. Mm-hmm. He's like coming back and not knowing if God had a place for you. And he's like, and yet he's like looking at the last couple of months, he's like, can you honestly tell me? He's like, what would it look like if you weren't here for everything that's been happening and the way that you've been communicating? And he's like watching the growth that's happening with you in the ministry because of that. He's like, do you believe God has you where he wants you? And I'm like, 100%.
Yeah. No, we can echo that from our perspective for sure. That, you've done a bunch of hugely important things over these last few months with all this stuff going on. I do want to highlight those two things. So I want to close with highlighting those two opportunities.
Okay.
And then just ways we can pray for you as well. But
sure.
To highlight those two, you mentioned it really quickly. There's a bunch of new students.
Yep.
This lady who's finding a bunch of new students.
Yep. Mrs. McLeish, incredible woman.
Goal of finding 200 in 3 months has found 50.
Yeah, so she started off in like July, and by the time school started, she had 30 new students already signed up. So we started off with that. As we were down for the first kind of hurricane relief weekend, we were there, and Ben, who's president of CCCD US, met with her in Kingston, and she's like, well, I already have 7 more students for Kingston, and she's like, I'm afraid to even tell you how many I have that are going to be ready for Knockpatrick. So I still haven't heard the official number yet. We're ballparking it that there's somewhere between 30 and 50 new students that'll happen within this year. And I think her goal has been either 200 or 250 students within the next 3 years and I'm like, from what she's already demonstrating, I'm like, definitely don't put that past her.
Yeah, so super cool. Also,
100%.
Huge challenge. By the time this comes out, I'm sure it'll be over 50.
I'm hoping, yeah.
That's and each kid takes this whole child sponsorship thing. Tell me a little bit about it. I know it takes $3,500 or so per student in monthly sponsorships to be able to keep them at the school. Yeah,
the sponsorship. So I think when we looked at it, I think it's around, because it's a residential school, so they live on campus. So you're living there, you're being fed there, school's there, all of these things that take place there. It's probably around at least $8,000 a year for each student. Now,
for each student, okay.
Yeah, now that's beyond just student sponsorship. So each child will have basically 10 sponsors, and that's at like $35 a month. So that's where that kind of,
I see.
That comes up. So you've got, what is it, $350 a month, and then times 12. So you're between $3,500 to $4,000 a year. But that makes up about half of it. The rest of it comes in through, like, when teams come down, there's some overhead that stays with the campuses that helps with that. Like churches that will have us on their budget and things. So there's other places where some of those funds come in. So when we talk about the 30 students, when we were starting in September, we're ballparking and going, well, that's $250,000 for this next year that we don't have any sponsors yet. We don't have any money. They're there. So September came in and they're there. So we have the responsibility to feed and house and care for them. But we don't have any money coming in yet for them. If we bump that up to 50, I mean, that's 400,000, for the year. And so that was part of my thing, is to start sharing these stories, and love that Grace, as a single church, kudos to Grace. I think Grace, ever since that first child sponsorship drive, like late 2017, 2018, you guys set an aggressive goal, and basically hit it. I chuckled the first year. I know what we had set for 100 and ended up being 99. And I remember talking to Brantley, and he's like, dude, if we'd have known, we'd have forced Ty to take one more, to hit that. But Grace has been an incredible partner in that. And I know that this month is going to be another one. We're already seeing sponsors signed up from Grace just after last week. And so that's a big portion. We've got that we're sharing with other churches. So when you start thinking, I'm like, if we add 250 students, what that does, I'm like, orders of magnitude. But that's an exciting thing for me. That's, again, this position allows me to share exciting stories and talk about life change for students. Not just, again, for that next 70 to 80, but for an eternity. And so, yeah, that really is something that gets me fired up in sharing these stories with people. It fires me up. I heard that Adam got to share their story about being partnered with Shauna Lee. Yeah, and I know what that does. I've seen teams from Grace who come down and get to meet the students they're sponsoring, watching those interactions, being a part of those interactions, and not just with Grace, but with other churches. And that's such a cool experience, not just for the student, but for the sponsors. And so I've been super excited, again, very grateful for everything that Grace has done in that. And like I said, since that first one, I think as a single church, I think you guys are hands down our largest, like, connected church. Not like you're the biggest congregation, but you have the most student sponsorships of any single church out there.
Well, there you go. So yeah, I don't know when this will come out, but we're pushing that right now in our Christmas project and hoping to sponsor more kids. Super cool opportunity. We love being able to do that. And then we're also giving toward the hurricane relief.
Right.
You're around $1.5 million maybe in rebuilding estimates.
Yeah.
Right now.
So each time we actually start to put hard numbers, that number keeps creeping up. I mean, when we first saw a few pictures, they were very limited pictures, and we were ballparking and thought, well, half, $750,000, and then we actually made it to campus, and that very quickly was easily identifiable that we're like, oh, we're going to be at least $1 million. And this past week, we just kind of actually put down hard numbers of even getting material here, because we're not sure we can even get all the materials on island. And the prices, even though there was to be no change in prices, the Prime Minister came out and said it was, verboten to increase the prices, and practically everything is already like on the upswing, which we knew was going to happen. And so we just costing out portions of that here and shipping materials down. We just took four of the roofs, nothing else. And that already pushed us to like $650,000. So we already know when we start adding everything else up, Ben and I have already put down numbers and gone, this will exceed $1.5 million. And that doesn't tell us what the long term is down the road. And it's not just the rebuilding, but like food prices on island continue to soar. They were already, like, over the last few years have been increasing, but now because you've totally wiped out crops and things like that, so access to the food is limited. What is available has gone up. What's not available has to be shipped in, and that goes up. So Sorry. So even knowing what, like, having students come back in, it's going to cost more to feed the students and all of these things. So where that final number ends up, I don't know, but I do know that God is aware of what that number will be. And my feeling has already gone ahead of us in so many ways. To see the response that we've already had has been astounding, humbling, encouraging. And so I'm really excited to see how this story finishes up, but I know God will be faithful in it.
Yeah, very cool. So that's definitely stuff we can be considering giving toward, also praying for. Just want to close out here. Any thoughts on just ways we can pray for you guys, your family, Ren, Caitlin, you, just in this season, ways we can be praying?
Yeah, absolutely. So as a family, again, I'm getting ready, like 2 days after Christmas, I leave for Jamaica for a month again. So while I'm traveling less, easily still a couple of months this year. And then after that, we're trusting that will, again, gravitate to lower numbers. But just praying for us as we, try to reestablish here. I think a lot of times it's actually harder to reestablish in what is your home culture than it is foreign culture, because when you go off to a different culture, you know that it's different. When you come back, now you're the one who's different, but you think that you know, and you just can't necessarily plug right back in. Relationships that we had years ago, not for bad reason, but over the course of the last 8 years, we've grown in different ways. So they've moved on and developed other places and other relationships, and we've done that. And so you can't just come back in and reinsert yourself. So just praying for us individually and corporately as a family to find those healthy places to be. Praying for us as a family, trying to navigate that. Because again, that adds stress when you don't have other resources. Praying for Caitlin specifically for health. Both, again, we're very transparent on it. I mean, hers is not just a physical health, but there's also mental health issues there. So praying as she transitions that. There are more resources back here. But sometimes, I mean, in American culture, I often will look at some of those resources and wish they were a little bit more towards the faith side that I might see in a different culture. But it's something that we need, and so we're trying to navigate that both as a family and with what's available. So yeah, I would say, and then again, for ways for us to continue serving, not just CCCD, but the church as a whole, and how we plug into that. Yeah, that would be another prayer request we have.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we'll definitely be praying for that. Thanks for sharing that. And yeah, looking forward to this Christmas season, and thanks
100%.
for taking the time as you're running around.
Yep.
Taking the time to talk to us and speak on tomorrow on Sunday, and we really appreciate you guys and your partnership.
Love being here, Grace.
Yeah.
If it wasn't 2.5 hours across each week, we'd probably be here far more than we are.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, man.
Thank you.